I stood in the shadows of the back hallway, a place meant for waiters and busboys, not for the father of the flower girl. My fingers worried the collar of the rented tuxedo. It was too tight, cutting into my neck every time I swallowed. The fabric was stiff, smelling overwhelmingly of mothballs, a stale chemical stench that seemed to cling to my skin. It was a constant physical reminder that I did not belong here. This was not my world. This was not my life. My jaw ached from clenching it. "Just for Sophie," I whispered to myself. The words had become a silent mantra, a shield against the humiliation. Just for Sophie. This was not a celebration for me. This was a penance. A self-inflicted torture I had to endure for the sake of my daughter. My 7-year-old daughter. I was a ghost at this feast, haunting the edges of a life I had once thought was mine. The suit cost $80. $80. The number echoed in my head, a bitter reminder of my failures. $80 was 2 full grocery bags. It was the gas I needed to get to the carpentry jobs I scrambled for across town. It was the copay for Sophie's last ear infection, a visit I had put off for 2 days, hoping it was just a cold, my stomach churning with the dread of that simple, unavoidable expense. The thought soured my stomach, mixing with the chemical smell of the tuxedo until I felt physically ill. I leaned against the smooth, cold marble wall, grateful for its solid chill. From the ballroom, I could hear the muffled sound of a string quartet. They were playing something classical and expensive music designed to sound like old money. The overpowering scent of lilies and roses, thousands of them, drifted from the open doorway, a wave of sickly sweet perfume that clashed violently with the mothball smell of my suit. I was a carpenter. I worked with my hands. I knew the smell of sawdust, of wood glue, of honest sweat. This place, this smell of too much money and too much perfume, it felt like a lie. My gaze was drawn to the crack in the door, a thin sliver of light in the dim hallway. I inched closer, a moth drawn to a flame that had already burned me. I peeked through, and I saw her, Jessica, my ex-wife. She was not just beautiful. She was radiant, a word I hated to use, but it was the only one that fit. She was a queen in her new kingdom, bathed in the warm, golden light of the chandeliers. Her dress, a cascading wave of white silk and lace, must have cost $10,000, maybe more, enough to pay my rent for 2 years. She was laughing, her head tilted back, her throat exposed. It was a laugh I had not heard in years, a laugh that was light and free and utterly, completely happy. She looked happier than I ever made her. The thought was a physical blow, a sharp, unexpected pain that shot through my chest. The tight tuxedo collar suddenly felt like a noose. I had told myself I was over her. I had told myself I was only here for Sophie, but seeing her like this, so completely luminous, so perfectly at home in a life that had no room for me, it reopened wounds I thought had scarred over. The pain was sharp. It was unexpected. And it was agonizing. I kept my eyes fixed on them, watching Jessica and the man beside her. Her new husband, Chad Thorne. He was the one. The architect of my ruin. The man who had taken everything. In my head, I had a name for him. The Shark. He was all polished white teeth and a smile so wide it looked painfully artificial. But it never ever reached his eyes. His eyes were cold, flat, and assessing. They were the eyes of a predator, constantly scanning the room for opportunity or weakness. Chad did not just steal my wife. That implies a simple crime of passion. What Chad did was a cold, systematic, and calculated execution. He liquidated my life. He converted a husband, a father, a home, and a marriage into a set of assets to be divided. And he made damn sure every valuable asset ended up on his side of the legal ledger. He was their family lawyer, a position of profound trust that he had twisted and poisoned. He was the constant whispering voice in Jessica's ear. He was the one who advised her. I could still hear the echo of his words repeated by Jessica during our final terrible fights. A simple carpenter, Ben. An unstable feast or famine business. This is not a sustainable future for Sophie. This is the smart move, the logical move. He had convinced her that divorcing me, the man who built her bookcases by hand, the man who rubbed her feet every night, the man who held her while she wept when her mother passed, was the smartest financial decision she could possibly make. He had managed to turn our love into a line item on a balance sheet. He had shown her a spreadsheet where I was a liability. He structured the entire settlement. He drowned me in a sea of legal paper, a blizzard of white that I could not see through. Documents filled with wherefores and parties of the first part, and clauses nested inside other clauses that made my head spin. I was a man who understood wood and straight lines and the satisfying bite of a sharp blade against grain. He buried me in paperwork designed to confuse, designed to obscure, designed to make me feel ignorant and stupid. And it worked. I had signed things I did not fully understand just to make the agonizing process stop, just to get out of the room, just to breathe. And now here he was. He had the prize. He had the wife. He had the connection to the powerful Peterson family name. And he believed he had the entire inheritance locked down. The memory rose up sharp and clear, cutting through the muffled sound of the string quartet. Me sitting in Chad's office. It was on one of the top floors, a high-rise palace of glass and steel that looked down on the rest of the world. I was wearing my work jeans stiff with dried wood glue and smelling of pine sawdust. I remembered feeling acutely aware of the dust I was probably leaving on his pristine $1,000 chair. The office itself was sterile, impersonal, and cold. It smelled of expensive treated leather and chemically refrigerated air conditioning. There was not a single personal item in sight, not a photo, not a plant, just sharp angles and cold reflective surfaces. Chad sat across from me behind a desk that looked like it was carved from a single massive mahogany tree. He looked perfect as always in a suit that probably cost more than my truck. He slid a stack of papers toward me. It was at least 2 inches thick. "Ben, this is just procedural," he said. His voice was a smooth, reassuring purr, the kind of voice that coaxes you into a cage. "We are just optimizing the assets for Jessica and Sophie's future. Optimizing the assets." I would never forget those words. He used words like optimized and leveraged and restructured. He used these clean, sterile corporate terms to describe the absolute demolition of my family. He was tearing my entire life down to the studs, and he described it like he was filing a tax return. And Jessica, she was there. She sat beside him, not across from me. She sat on his side of the desk. She wore a gray, business-like dress I had never seen before. She refused to make eye contact. While my world was ending, while the legal framework for removing me from my daughter's life was being laid out, she just stared at her phone. Her thumb swiped up and up, checking her email or her stocks or her social media, as if the end of our 10-year marriage was a boring meeting and inconvenient appointment she just had to get through before brunch. My stomach twisted. I snapped back to the present, back to the ballroom. I watched as Chad the shark leaned in toward Jessica. He placed his hand on her waist, his grip possessive. He kissed her. It was not a kiss of tenderness. It was not the kiss of a lover. It was a performance for the crowd. It was a brand being pressed onto livestock. It was a claim of ownership. He was showing everyone in that opulent room exactly what and who he had won, and I was the loser standing in the shadows, forced to watch. I pushed off the cold marble wall. My resolve, which had been failing, hardened again. I had to see Sophie. I slipped through the tall oak doors, forcing myself to melt into the shadows along the richly papered wall. The ballroom was not just large, it was cavernous. It was an obscene, suffocating display of wealth. My carpenter's eye, a part of my brain I could not turn off, was instinctively trying to calculate the cost of it all. The ceiling was at least 30 feet high, draped in thousands of yards of white silk. An entire wall, literally an entire wall, was constructed of flowers. It was a solid, fragrant mass of white roses and lilies that must have cost more than my truck. Giant ice sculptures carved into the shape of swans melted slowly and uselessly on mirrored tables, reflecting the blinding light from crystal chandeliers. Waiters in pristine white gloves moved through the wealthy crowd like ghosts, their silver trays held high. This was not a wedding reception. This was a coronation, a celebration of a successful corporate takeover. I kept my head down. My shoulders were hunched, a posture I had developed over the last year trying to make myself and my cheap suit invisible. I just wanted to get one look at my daughter. As I navigated the edge of the room, keeping close to the floral wall, a hand shot out. It was brittle with bones and heavy with rings, and it grasped my arm. I flinched, startled, lynched. "Excuse me," a sharp nasal voice cut right through the orchestral music. I turned. A woman whose face was pulled alarmingly tight stared past my left ear. Her skin was like stretched parchment, but the diamonds on her neck and ears were blinding. She did not look at me. She looked through me as if I were a piece of furniture. "I need a glass of the Veuve Clicquot," she commanded. Her voice was sharp and patient. "Now!" She was not asking. She was giving an order. She thought I was a waiter. The mothball suit, the cheap scuffed leather shoes. I was part of the staff. My mouth opened. A hot, angry retort died on my lips. "I am not," I started to say. But she had already released my arm. She had turned away, her attention already captured by someone she deemed more important. She snapped her fingers, a sharp, cracking sound that cut through the air at an actual waiter who was passing by. "Service here?" She barked, her voice dripping with irritation. I closed my mouth. The $80 suit, the chemical smell. It was a uniform. My status here was clear. I was a servant. The anger evaporated instantly, leaving only that cold, familiar, sinking shame. I was nobody. I swallowed the shame, pushing it down. I pushed deeper into the room, my eyes scanning the elevated main table at the front. There, I finally spotted her. Sophie. She was sitting at the massive table wedged between Jessica and her new unknown aunt, but she looked utterly, profoundly alone. She looked like a tiny princess locked in a very tall, very cold tower. Her lilac dress, which I knew Jessica had picked out without consulting me, seemed too big for her small frame. She looked small and lost, a fragile, breakable thing in this room of loud voices and sharp laughter. She was not eating. She was just pushing a sliver of cake apiece from a towering structure with many tiers around her gold-rimmed plate. She was using a silver fork that looked too heavy for her hand. Her head was down. But then, as if she could feel my eyes on her, her head snapped up. Her eyes scanned the crowd. They were wide, searching, a little frightened by the noise and the sheer number of people. Her gaze swept past me once. Then it snapped back, locking onto me. A smile exploded across her face. It was not a polite smile. It was not a small, wedding-appropriate smile. It was a brilliant, desperate, life-saving smile. It was the smile of a drowning person who has just spotted a lifeboat. It was pure, unfiltered, unconditional joy. That smile. My God, that smile. It hit me straight in the chest, pushing all the air from my lungs. It was the only real thing in this entire cavernous $1,000-a-plate room. Everything else was a performance. The flowers were a performance. The music was a performance. Jessica's laugh was a performance. But that smile that was real. It was my one anchor in this churning ocean of hypocrisy. It was the only reason I was here. It was the only reason I was breathing. I gave her a weak smile back. I could not manage anything more, but I raised my hand in a small secret wave, just for her. Her response was immediate. Her whole arm shot up, flapping wildly back and forth, a 7-year-old's pure, unashamed greeting. "Daddy!" I could just barely read the shape of the word on her lips. The joy lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Jessica, who had been laughing at something Chad said, noticed the outburst from her daughter. Her head snapped toward Sophie. Her smile vanished, replaced by a cold, tight mask. She leaned over a queen, addressing a misbehaving subject, and whispered something sharp and quick into Sophie's ear. I watched helpless as Sophie's face crumpled. The smile died as if a light switch had been flipped. Her arm dropped immediately, falling limply to her lap. She looked down at her plate, her shoulders slumping in defeat. She had been corrected. She had been reminded of the rules. And that was the moment. That was when the real failure settled onto my shoulders. It was a cold, heavy weight. My failure was not just the divorce. It was not just the loss of my business, or my house, or my wife. It was this. It was standing here watching my daughter be reprimanded for loving me in public. It was my daughter, my bright, beautiful girl, sitting at a table with a man I despised, a shark in a tuxedo, while her real father was forced to hide in the shadows. I was a visitor in the life of my own daughter. I was the embarrassing relative, the man in the cheap suit. This was the humiliation that mattered. This was the one that would scar. I watched Chad move through the crowd, a glass of champagne in his hand. He was a master of this environment, gliding effortlessly from one cluster of wealthy guests to another. He would clap a man on the shoulder, his laugh booming. He would lean in to kiss a woman's cheek, his hand lingering on her back. He was all practiced charisma and polished surfaces, a suit filled with ambition. Watching him work, watching him own this room made my stomach clench. He was the absolute perfect opposite of the man who had actually built all of this. I could not stop myself from thinking of Frank, Jessica's father, Frank Peterson. Frank was the only one in Jessica's orbit who had ever truly seen me. He was the only one who mattered. He was a self-made man in the truest sense of the phrase, tough as old leather, a man who had clawed his way up from nothing. He had built a real estate empire not with spreadsheets and lawsuits, but with gravel and concrete and sheer stubborn grit. He and I were builders. We understood each other on a level that Chad the Shark could never comprehend. Frank worked in brick and steel. I worked in wood. We both knew the profound satisfaction of ending a long day with sore hands, aching backs, and something real to show for our labor. We had made things. Chad made nothing. He only acquired. He only took. A specific memory pushed its way to the front of my mind, vivid and clear. It was one Saturday afternoon, maybe a year before the divorce, before everything went wrong. I was at the Peterson estate helping Frank restore the massive old oak gate at the end of his driveway. The thing was ancient. The hinges rusted solid, the wood warping. Frank, who must have been 65 years old at the time, was right there with me. He was wearing old denim overalls, his sleeves rolled up, and he had grease up to his elbows. We were sweating and cursing, fighting a rusted bolt when Chad's spotless black Mercedes whispered up the gravel road. He did not even get out of the car. He just rolled down the tinted window, his expensive sunglasses hiding his eyes. He looked annoyed. "Jessica," he called out, his voice smooth and impatient. "We are going to be late for the reservation." He looked at Frank, his own father-in-law, and then at me. He scanned us, covered in rust grease and sawdust. His lip curled just slightly. He looked at us like we were something primitive, something pathetic he had found on the bottom of his shoe. Then he sped off, spitting gravel from his tires. Frank stopped what he was doing. He straightened up slowly, his back cracking. He watched the black car disappear. He picked up a greasy rag and wiped his hands, his movements slow and deliberate. "That one," Frank said, his voice a low, gravelly growl. "He's a parasite, Ben." He spat on the ground. "All silver words and a tin soul. He doesn't make anything, he just takes." The memory deepened, shifting, melting into a later evening. We had finally won. The gate was rehung, swinging smoothly and silently on its newly greased hinges. Frank and I were sitting on his wide wraparound porch, drinking cold beers as the sun went down. The air smelled of cut grass and the sharp tang of motor oil. We sat in a comfortable silence for a long time, the way only men who have worked hard together can. Then Frank turned to me, his expression serious in the dimming light. "He only loves numbers, Ben," he said, his voice quiet, turning the beer bottle in his calloused hands. "You need to understand that about him. He looks at my daughter. He looks at my company. He looks at this house, this land." Frank paused, taking a long drink. "He doesn't see a family. He doesn't see a home. He doesn't see a legacy. He just sees a number. A very, very big one." He set the bottle down with a heavy click. "Be careful." I nodded at the time, but I did not truly understand. I was naive. I was blinded by my love for Jessica. I thought our history, our home, our daughter. I thought those things were the foundation. I thought our marriage was built on something solid. I was wrong. The foundation was rotting right under my feet, and I was too stupid and too trusting to see it. Chad was the rot. Standing there in the back of the opulent ballroom, a ghost in my cheap suit, I finally understood. It had not just been a father-in-law's casual dislike. It was a warning, a desperate warning from one builder to another. Frank saw the shark circling. He saw exactly what Chad was long before anyone else. He was trying to warn me. He was trying to protect his daughter from the man she was infatuated with, and he was trying to protect his life's work from the man he knew would one day try to consume it. My thoughts twisted, settling on the last time I ever spoke to Frank Peterson. It was after the divorce was finalized, after Chad and Jessica had finished optimizing me out of my own life. I was in my new, tiny, empty apartment. I was sitting on a cardboard moving box, the smell of paint and cheap new carpet hanging in the air. The phone rang. I was surprised to see his name. His voice was weak. It was a dry rasp, a shadow of the strong, gravelly voice I knew. The illness he had been hiding, the one he dismissed as just a bad cough, was winning. "I'm sorry, son," he rasped. That one word, son, just about broke me. It cracked clean through the numb defensive wall I had built around myself. I had to clench my jaw, biting the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood, just to keep from breaking down right there on the phone. "I'm so sorry, Ben," he said again, and I could hear the rattling in his chest. She is making a terrible, terrible mistake." There was so much pain in his voice, so much guilt and so much regret. I told him it was okay. I lied. I told him I would be fine. I told him not to worry. We hung up. 3 months after that phone call, a sudden massive heart attack took him, and now just 6 short months after his funeral, here we were. Jessica was marrying the parasite. The shark was celebrating his final victory, raising a glass of champagne in the very house that Frank had built with his bare hands. The entire grotesque, obscenely expensive event felt like a desecration. It was a party on his grave, and I was the only one here who seemed to know it. I found a waiter, one who did not mistake me for a colleague, and asked for a glass of water. No ice. My hands were shaking slightly, and I needed something to hold something to do. I gripped the cool, heavy glass. The water was flat, tasteless. I stood there at the back of the room, nursing this simple glass of water like it was a lifeline, and I let my mind drift back over the past 6 months. After Frank's death, the silence he left behind was immediately filled by Chad. As the official family lawyer, he handled everything. That was the word he used, handled. He did it with a speed and efficiency that everyone else called admirable. I called it obscene. There was no time for grief. There was no time for quiet reflection. There was only optimization. Chad called a brief meeting, not at the family estate full of Frank's presence and memories. No, he held it in the same sterile high-rise conference room where he had disemboweled my marriage. We all sat around that same massive, polished mahogany table. Jessica, her eyes red from crying, though I could not tell if it was from grief or exhaustion. Her aunts and uncles looking restless and greedy. And me. I was there for some reason I still did not understand, maybe as a final formal humiliation. Chad stood at the head of the table, not looking like a mourner, but like a CEO about to announce quarterly profits. He had a slim, leather-bound folder in front of him. He opened it. He cleared his throat. He announced in a voice dripping with feigned solemnity that Frank, in his final grief-stricken state, before he passed, had drawn up a new, simpler will. That was the first lie, the first one that made the acid in my stomach churn. Grief-stricken. I was the last person who spoke to him. Frank was not grief-stricken. He was furious. He was clear-eyed. He was a man who knew his time was short and was desperate to stop the parasite he saw at his gates. But I said nothing. "Who would believe me?" Chad continued. He explained that Frank, wanting to ensure his beloved daughter's security, had streamlined his assets. He had left almost everything directly to Jessica. The company, the estate, the liquid assets, the stocks, everything. A clean transfer. And just like that, Chad had won. He had won it all. It was a total, complete, devastating victory. He had secured the girl the brilliant prize he had counseled and manipulated. He had secured the company, the real estate empire Frank had built from nothing. He had secured the entire family fortune. And now, 6 months later, he was standing in the middle of this grand ballroom, wearing his victory like a king's robe, accepting the congratulations of the world. And me. What did I get? I got an invitation printed on thick, expensive cardstock to watch him marry my ex-wife. An invitation extended for Sophie's sake. A polite, cruel twist of the knife forcing me to be a witness to my own erasure. I got the pitying looks from guests who knew exactly who I was. I was the ex-husband, the carpenter, the failed starter marriage. I was the prologue to their grand story. I was the unfortunate backstory, the gritty black and white photo they showed before the real movie, the one in glorious, expensive color, began. I took a sip of water, but my throat was still dry. I thought back to that day in the conference room. I thought about the will Chad had produced. Even then, in my numb, defeated state, it felt wrong. It was a deep, gut-level wrongness, the way a piece of wood feels wrong when you know there is a hidden rot deep inside it. It was too simple. Too clean. Frank Peterson was not a simple man. He was a complex, brilliant, and often difficult man. He was a builder. He built complex deals, complex buildings, a complex life. The idea that he would just sign a simple 2-page document leaving everything to one person, the very person he knew, was being manipulated by Chad. It was unthinkable. It was a betrayal of everything I knew about him. And then there was the detail. The one that Chad had glossed over so quickly, his voice smooth as oil. The will, while leaving everything to Jessica, named Chad Thorne as a provisional co-signer on all estate accounts. Just a formality, Chad had assured everyone, his polished smile firmly in place. To help Jessica with the transition, to optimize the tax burden. Just standard procedure. The aunts and uncles nodded, their eyes glazed over. Jessica, lost in her own fog, just signed where he told her to sign. But I saw it. I saw it for exactly what it was. It was not a formality. It was a power grab, plain and simple. It was a legal coup. He had not just advised the new queen. He had legally bound himself to her throne. He had his hand on the vault, and the ink was not even dry on Frank's death certificate. But what could I do? What could Ben Reed, the carpenter, possibly do? I had no power to question it. I was the outsider. I was the man in the sawdust-covered jeans sitting in a room of $1,000 suits. I knew about wood grain and load-bearing walls. What did I know about corporate law? What did I know about codicils and estate taxes and fiduciary duty? I knew nothing, and Chad knew that I knew nothing. He had counted on it. He had built his entire plan on my perceived stupidity. My only inheritance from Frank Peterson, the only thing he had left me, was not in that will. It was not in any bank account. My inheritance was that one final desperate phone call. My inheritance was the sound of his rasping, dying voice saying, "She is making a terrible, terrible mistake." My inheritance was the warning. And standing here in this palace built on lies, it was the only real thing I had left. The chandeliers overhead, which had blazed with the intense light of 1,000 false suns, began to dim. The constant high-pitched murmur of conversation, a wall of sound built from empty laughter and brittle gossip, softened. It faded, dying away until a heavy, expectant hush fell over the entire cavernous room. A single sharp spotlight cut through the manufactured twilight. It swept across the sea of expensive tables, glinted off the melting ice sculptures, and finally landed perfectly on the main stage. Chad Thorne was already standing. He tapped a silver knife against his crystal champagne flute. The sound was a sharp, clear ping, 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 a summons that demanded and received absolute obedience. He raised his glass, his other arm wrapped possessively around Jessica's waist. He looked like a conqueror. He looked like a king addressing his newly captured subjects. He looked above all smugly, profoundly triumphant. "To my Jessica," his voice boomed. It was the voice I remembered from that sterile office, a slick, practiced, professional voice. It was the voice of a man who loved more than anything else in the world the sound of his own words. It echoed slightly in the vast, silent room. "You finally have the life you deserve." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Jessica looked up at him, her eyes shining with an adoration that made my stomach turn. "A life." Chad continued, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more intimate, more sincere sounding. "Built on a solid foundation." And then he paused again. It was a longer pause this time, a perfect, calculated, dramatic beat. His smile widened, but it did not touch his eyes. His cold, shark-like eyes scanned the room, moving deliberately past the tables of wealthy guests, past the floral wall, traveling with unerring accuracy all the way to the shadows at the back of the room where I stood pinned against the wall. He found me. He locked his gaze with mine. He knew I was there. He had known all along. He had waited for this exact moment. He wanted me to hear this. He wanted the entire room to hear this. He held my gaze, a predator savoring the kill, and that polished reptilian smile widened just a fraction more. "And not," he continued, his voice laced with pure, undisguised venomous contempt, "on sawdust and empty promises." It was a direct hit, a sniper shot. The words, aimed with perfect, brutal precision, hung in the air and then detonated. He had just announced my failure, my worthlessness, to 100 of the most influential people in the city. He had done it at his wedding with my ex-wife on his arm and my daughter at his table. A wave of polite, cruel laughter rippled through the room. It was not a loud laugh. It was a quiet, knowing, sophisticated titter. It was the sound of wealthy people acknowledging a clever, sharp-edged joke. They were all in on it. They all knew exactly who the sawdust and empty promises referred to. They were all looking at the poor, pathetic first husband. I was the punchline. I felt the blood rush to my face. It was an instant, hot, burning wave that started in my chest and flooded my cheeks, my ears, my scalp. My skin felt tight as if it were shrinking. My vision tunneled the edges of the grand ballroom, blurring into darkness, leaving only the sight of Chad smiling in the center. I could feel the pitying stares, the sideways glances, the barely concealed smirks. I was a spectacle, the court jester in the rented mothball suit, my hand shoved deep into the pocket of the cheap rental pants clenched into a tight, white-knuckled fist. My fingernails dug hard into my palm, the rough fabric straining across my knuckles. I wanted to hit him. I wanted to leap across the tables and shatter that perfect, smug $10,000 veneer face. I wanted to throw my glass of water. I wanted to flip a table. I wanted to yell. I wanted to scream at all of them at their polite, empty, soulless faces. I wanted to tell them he was a liar. He was a parasite. He was the tin-souled man Frank Peterson had warned me about. But I did not move. I was frozen, drowning in that red-hot tide of humiliation. And then I saw her. As I was burning alive, my eyes found Sophie. She was sitting at the main table, caught in the edge of the spotlight. She was not looking at Chad. She was not looking at her mother. She was watching me. Her small face was pale, her dark eyes wide with a fear and a worry that no 7-year-old should ever have to feel. Her smile from earlier was completely gone, replaced by a look of profound adult-like concern. She had heard it. She had not understood the words, not all of them, but she understood the tone. She understood the cruelty. She knew with the simple, devastating clarity of a child that her new stepfather had just hurt her father. And he had done it on purpose. Her eyes were locked on mine. She was waiting. She was begging me not to react, begging me to be okay. Seeing her face, seeing that terror in her eyes, it was like a bucket of ice water dumped over my head. The rage did not disappear, but it froze. It solidified into something hard and heavy and cold in my gut. I could not do this to her. I could not make a scene. I could not give Chad the satisfaction. I could not prove him right. I could not be the unstable, emotional failure he had just painted me to be. Slowly, with a physical effort that cost me everything I had, I forced my hand to unclench inside my pocket. My palm stung where my nails had broken the skin. I forced my face into something that I prayed looked like a smile, though I was sure it was a grotesque, painful grimace. I gave her a tiny, forced wink, a quick, almost invisible gesture, a signal just for her. I am okay. It is just words. It does not matter. She saw the wink. Her small shoulders, which had been tensed up around her ears, relaxed. Just a fraction. She looked back down at her plate. I had lied. I was not okay. I was being flayed alive in front of a room full of strangers. I was humiliated. I was trapped. And the man who had done it, the shark who had taken everything, was now leaning over to kiss his new bride. He was basking in the applause of the crowd, the hero of the hour, the man who had built his new life on a solid foundation. Chad drank in the applause. He savored it, his smile wide, his arm firmly anchored around Jessica's waist. He was the king of his own story, the author of my humiliation, and this was his coronation. He raised the crystal flute, the bubbles sparkling in the spotlight. He was about to drink to seal his victory, to swallow the future he had stolen. And that was when the main doors of the ballroom swung open. They did not just open. They were pushed hard, swinging wide and crashing into the padded walls with two resonant echoing thumps that cut through the polite applause. The applause faltered, died. The string quartet, which had just started to swell again, went silent, one of the violins screeching into a sour, ugly note. Every head in the room, which had been turned toward the stage, snapped back toward the entrance. A woman stood silhouetted in the doorway. She was not a late guest. She was not a member of the hotel staff. She was an intrusion. She was an alien. She wore a severe, dark navy suit tailored so sharply it looked like armor. Her hair was pulled back into a tight, merciless bun. She carried a thick, heavy black leather briefcase in her left hand, holding it not like a purse, but like a weapon. She radiated an aura of cold corporate power. It was an energy so foreign to this room of soft silks, wilting flowers, and celebratory drunkenness that it made everything instantly look ridiculous. The ice sculptures looked frivolous. The $10,000 dress looked like a costume. The entire opulent $1 million event suddenly felt like a child's tea party. A wedding planner, a frantic woman in a black dress with a headset, scurried toward the intruder, her face a mask of professional panic. "Madam," the planner hissed, her hands fluttering. "Madam, this is a private event. You cannot be in here. I must ask you to leave." The woman in the navy suit did not slow down. She did not look at the planner. She did not acknowledge her existence. She simply walked past her, her gaze fixed with unnerving, singular purpose on the stage. The planner left in her wake just stood there, her mouth open, her authority utterly dissolved. The woman, Ms. Evelyn Hayes, though I did not know her name, then began her walk. She moved from the carpeted entrance onto the polished hardwood dance floor, and with every step, her heels clicked. A sharp, loud, relentless click. Clack, click, clack. The sound was an assault. It was the only sound in the vast tomb-silent ballroom. It was the sound of a clock ticking down. It was the sound of a gavel falling. It cut through the perfumed air, a rhythm of pure, unadulterated, ice-cold business. The string quartet who had been shuffling their sheet music went completely still, their bows frozen in midair. They stared as we all did. She walked straight through the center of the room. She did not weave between the tables. She walked in a perfectly straight, perfectly calculated line, forcing guests to pull their chairs in to lean away from her, as if her presence alone might freeze them. She reached the steps to the main stage and ascended them without hesitation. She was in the spotlight now, standing just 3 feet from Chad and Jessica. The light was harsh on her pale, unsmiling face. Chad's smile was gone. It had not faded. It had been erased. His face, which seconds before had been flush with victory, was now a tight, pale mask of pure, undisguised annoyance. His perfect, scripted moment was shattered. His celebration was contaminated. The woman in the navy suit stepped directly to the microphone. She did not ask for permission. She simply leaned toward it. "Forgive the interruption," she said. Her voice was exactly like her suit. It was sharp, clear, perfectly tailored, and absolutely cold. It was a voice that held no room for argument. It was not an apology. It was a statement of fact. It sliced through the silence, amplified, booming into every corner of the room. Chad bristled. He visibly puffed out his chest, stepping forward to reclaim his territory, to reassert his dominance. He put his lawyer voice on the one I remembered so well, the one that was meant to belittle and dismiss. "I am Chad Thorne," he snapped, his voice tight with anger. "I am the family's legal representative. Whatever this is, whatever papers you think you have, you can give them to me. Now, this is a private—" "No," Ms. Hayes said. That single word, spoken without heat, without emotion, just a flat, cold "no," stopped Chad cold. He had been mid-rant and he literally shut his mouth. She looked at him, her eyes as flat and gray as a winter sky. "No," she repeated. "I am Evelyn Hayes. I am from Donovan, Shaw and Associates." A flicker of something. I saw it on Chad's face. A tiny, involuntary twitch in his jaw. He knew that name. I did not, but he did. That name was heavy. "My instructions," Ms. Hayes continued, her voice unchanging, "were explicit. They are precise, and they are legally binding. I have a document that can only be delivered in person at this location on this date." She paused, her cold gaze leaving Chad and beginning to scan the sea of frozen, upturned faces. She was looking for someone. The entire opulent $1 million room held its breath. "I am here," she announced, her voice booming into the microphone, "to deliver this document to a Mr. Benjamin Reed." The light beam snapped off Chad. It was no longer a spotlight. It was a searchlight. It swung away from the stage, white, harsh, and brutal, and began to sweep across the darkened ballroom floor. It was hunting. And as the light moved, every head in that room moved with it. It was a slow, sickening wave. 100 faces, 100 sets of eyes, all turning in unison, following the beam. They were looking for me, the man in the shadows, the ghost at the feast. I was no longer invisible. I was prey. I was the thing in the dark, and the light was coming for me. I felt my entire body go cold. I was pinned, exposed, an animal caught in a trap. My blood turned to ice water. My heart, which had been hammering with rage, seemed to stop completely. Me. The word was a silent scream in my skull. Benjamin Reed, no. It was a mistake. It had to be a mistake, a cruel, terrible, twisted mistake. My first panicked thought was a summons. Was I being sued? Had I missed a payment on my truck? My mind scrambled, desperate. Child support. No. God, no. I always paid that first. I paid that before I paid my rent, before I bought food. I would have sold my tools, I would have sold my blood before I missed that payment. Then the real cold logical fear set in. This was a trap. This was Chad. This was the final devastating move in his game of humiliation. Of course, he had arranged this. He had paid this woman to come here to call my name, to serve me with fake papers, to have me arrested for some fabricated debt. This was the true punchline to his sawdust and empty promises toast. This was the grand finale. He was not just going to let me be the humiliated ex-husband in the back row. He was going to have me dragged out in handcuffs. He was going to complete my destruction in front of my daughter, in front of the woman I once loved, in front of the entire watching world. The light found me. It hit me full in the face, blinding me. I was pinned against the wall. I could feel the collective weight of 200 eyes. I could feel their curiosity, their pity, their contempt. I could not run. I could not hide. I was trapped. I took a single step forward out of the shadow. My legs felt like they were full of wet concrete. The mothball suit, my uniform of shame, suddenly felt like it was on fire. I took another step. I was moving across the open floor into the center of the room. I felt like I was walking to my own execution. I reached the edge of the polished dance floor. I stopped squinting up at the stage, a silhouette against the blinding light. "I am," I said. My voice was a dry, broken croak. I swallowed a thick, painful rasp in my throat. "I am Ben Reed." On the stage, Ms. Evelyn Hayes did not smile. Her face was impassive, carved from cold stone. She simply nodded once, a sharp, precise movement. "Mr. Reed, what the hell is this?" Chad's voice was no longer a smooth, practiced boom. It was a roar, a raw, guttural, red-faced explosion of pure rage. The mask of the polished lawyer was gone. This was the shark teeth bared. "This is my wedding. This is a private event." He spat my name as if it were something foul. "Ben, he is nobody. He is nothing. He has nothing to do with this family. Security, get him out of here. Get her out of here." He was lunging for the microphone, but Ms. Hayes was faster. She did not look at him. She did not flinch. She ignored his sputtering, violent tantrum as if he were a noisy fly, a complete irrelevance. She turned her body slightly, a subtle shift that addressed not just me, but the entire silent, breathless room. She leaned back into the microphone. "Mr. Frank Peterson," she announced. The name dropped into the room like a block of granite. The silence, which had been heavy, became absolute. It became a suffocating, pressurized void. No one breathed. No one moved. "Mr. Frank Peterson," she repeated, her voice cutting through the void, "signed a new last will and testament with our firm. He signed it 48 hours before his passing." She paused, letting the weight of those two words, 48, sink into the room, crushing all air. "He gave explicit, legally binding instructions." She concluded, her voice like ice, that it was to be executed and publicly delivered on this date, at this event. Ms. Hayes did not summon me to the stage. She did not need to. She simply stood there in the center of the harsh white spotlight, holding the thick cream-colored envelope, and she waited. The entire room, the entire world waited. My legs felt like lead. I was acutely aware of every single sound I made as I walked. The scuff of my cheap rented shoes on the polished floor. The whisper of the cheap woolen pants. I was the center of 100 pairs of eyes. I could hear someone whisper, "That is him," as I passed. The walk from the back of the room to the stage felt like it took a year. I ascended the 2 short steps, my body moving on an instinct that was not my own. I was in the spotlight now, the heat of it prickling my face. I stood 3 feet from her. Ms. Hayes opened her heavy black briefcase. The 2 brass snaps clicked open, a sound that was shockingly loud in the pressurized silence. She did not rummage. She reached in and retrieved the envelope. It was thick, heavy, and sealed with a circle of dark red wax. It looked official. It looked final. She held it out to me. My hand rose to meet it. I watched my own hand as if it belonged to someone else. It was shaking, a violent, uncontrollable tremor. I saw the ingrained dirt, the calluses on every knuckle, the faint, permanent stain of wood varnish under my short fingernails. My rough, working man's hand looked primitive, almost dirty, as it moved toward that pristine, powerful document. My fingers closed around the thick paper. It was heavy. "Wait!" Jessica's voice. It was not the smooth, bridal, queenly voice. It was a sharp, high-pitched, ugly sound. It was the sound of panic. She stumbled forward, her hand clutching the bodice of her $10,000 dress. "Wait!" she shrieked, her eyes wide and terrified, locked on the envelope in my hand. "That is not possible. That cannot be." She turned a frantic, desperate movement toward her new husband. "Chad," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Chad, tell her. My father left everything to me. We had the will. You handled the will. You handled everything." Chad was frozen. His face, which had been flushed with victory and arrogance, was now a pale, mottled, sickly white. He looked like a man who had just swallowed poison. He opened his mouth, but only a strange, strangled, gurgling sound came out. Ms. Hayes did not look at Jessica. She did not look at Chad. She looked at me, but her voice was pitched to address the entire breathless room. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice, a cold, sharp instrument, "handled an older will, a document signed over 1 year ago." She turned her head, a slow, deliberate movement. Her cold, impassive eyes pinned Jessica, who flinched as if she had been struck. "This one," Ms. Hayes continued, tapping a single perfectly manicured finger on the envelope I was crushing in my trembling grip, "was signed later. 48 hours before Mr. Peterson's passing, to be exact. It was fully witnessed by 2 senior partners at my firm. It is, I assure you, ironclad, and it supersedes all previous documents." She paused. The legal finality of her words hung in the air, a death sentence. Jessica made a small, wounded sound like an animal. "And," Ms. Hayes concluded, her voice dropping just enough to pull the entire room in, "it names a sole executor." My heart was a painful, heavy drum against my ribs. My breath was shallow. I looked down at the envelope. I could see the wax seal clearly now. It was Frank's personal emblem, an ornate, stylized P. My thumb, rough and stained, pushed against the hard wax. It cracked. The sound was a small, tearing final rip that seemed to echo in the dead silence. I fumbled with the flap. I pulled out the contents. There were 2 items. The first was a thick document, perhaps 20 pages, bound with a thick blue legal ribbon. The top of the front page read in severe black letters, "Last Will and Testament of Franklin T. Peterson." The second item was a single sheet of paper, a yellow legal-sized sheet folded twice. I unfolded it. It was covered in handwriting. It was not the weak, shaky, frail script of a sick man. It was Frank's. It was the bold, angry, powerful script of the man I knew. The letters were pressed hard into the paper, the ink a dark, furious black. It was the handwriting of the builder. My vision blurred. The words swam in and out of focus. I blinked hard. I tried to read it, my mind scrambling, unable to process the words. I read the first one. "Ben." I read the next line. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and it means Jessica was foolish enough to go through with marrying that snake." My heart stopped. I read the words again. That snake. My hands were shaking so badly the paper was rattling, a quiet rustling sound. I realized with a jolt that the entire room was watching me read. They were waiting. Ms. Hayes was waiting. "Read it aloud." "Mr. Reed," Ms. Hayes said. Her voice was quiet, but it was not a suggestion. It was a command. "As instructed." I looked up from the page. I looked at the microphone. I looked out at the sea of pale, frozen, expectant faces. I looked at Sophie, who was watching me, her eyes wide. I looked at Jessica, who was trembling her hand over her mouth. And I looked at Chad, who was staring at the yellow paper in my hand with a look of pure, primal terror. I cleared my throat. My throat was raw dry. I stepped up to the microphone. I held the letter up. "Ben," I began. My voice was a weak, pathetic, trembling whisper. It was the voice of the man in the mothball suit. I stopped. I was furious with myself. I took one deep, shuddering breath. I was done whispering. I was done being the ghost. I started again. This time my voice was loud. It was clear. It was amplified, and it boomed across the silent room, a voice of judgment. "Ben," I read, "if you are reading this, it means I am gone. And it means Jessica was foolish enough to go through with marrying that snake. I am sorry, son. I knew he was trouble." I said the word. Son. Frank's word for me. The word he had used on the phone. A sharp, sudden burning pain tightened my throat, but I pushed through it. I would not cry. Not here. I kept reading. "He is a con man." I heard a small, sharp gasp from Jessica. My eyes did not leave the page. "He has been hiding massive business debts." I read, and I could feel Chad's hatred, a physical burning heat washing over the stage. "He saw my company as his personal piggy bank. He manipulated my daughter. He flattered her, and he lied to her to get his hands on it." "Chad." It was Jessica. Her voice was a horrified, broken whisper. She was pulling at his arm, her face a mask of dawning, ugly realization. "Chad, What debts? What is he talking about? What debts? Chad did not answer her. He was staring at me. His face was no longer pale. It was a deep mottled purple red. It is a lie, he finally roared, finding his voice. It was not a boom. It was a scream. It is a lie, slander. You cannot read that. That is slander. You are... I will continue, I said, and my own voice cut him off. It was stronger now. It was as cold and hard as the marble wall I had been leaning against. I was not Ben the carpenter anymore. I was Frank Peterson's voice. I was his vengeance. I was his will. I looked back at the letter. I cannot trust my own daughter with the empire I built. I read that line and I did look at Jessica. The words hit her. They landed like a physical blow. Her face crumpled, her entire body seeming to fold in on itself. The word snake was an insult to Chad. The word weak was a judgment on her. She is weak. I read the words echoing Frank's condemnation. She listens to the last voice she heard, and I damn well will not trust that tin-souled parasite she married. The room was a vacuum. All the air had been sucked out. The silence was absolute. Tin-souled parasite. The exact words. The words from the porch. The warning I had been too stupid to understand. I was at the end of the letter. My hands were still shaking, but it was not from fear or weakness anymore. It was a current. It was adrenaline. It was a terrible, cold, righteous power that was thrumming through my veins. I looked down at the final lines. But I trust you, Ben. My voice cracked just once on that single word. You. I continued, my voice gaining strength. You are a builder. You are honest. You have sawdust under your nails. I instinctively glanced down at my own hands, my shaking, calloused, sawdust-stained hands. I saw them for the first time as Frank had seen them, not as a mark of failure, but as a badge of honor. I read the final sentence, the final judgment, the final word that would change everything. You are the only one. I read my voice ringing with the absolute final truth of his words, who never asked me for a single damn thing. I finished reading the letter. The silence that followed was not just quiet. It was a vacuum, a physical void where the applause for Chad used to be. I lowered the yellow handwritten sheet. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. It was a thick, heavy thump, thump, thump in my ears, loud enough to be amplified by the microphone. My eyes dropped to the other document in my hand, the legal one, the thick document, 20 pages bound in blue. This was the engine. The letter was just the fuel. Ben, I looked up. It was Jessica. Her voice was a dry, broken whisper, a sound I barely recognized. She was no longer the queen. Her dress, the one that cost $10,000, looked like a ridiculous costume. Her face was a ruined pale, streaked with running makeup, her eyes wide with a terror that was just dawning. Ben, please, she whispered, desperate. What does it say? The other paper. What does it say? What did my father do? I looked past her. I looked past the woman who had discarded me. My eyes found Chad. He was still vibrating with a rage so profound it seemed to shake the very stage. He looked like an animal cornered, ready to rip out my throat. He was waiting. They were all waiting. I took a deep breath. The air I pulled in felt different. It was cold and sharp, and it tasted like power. The mothball suit did not feel tight anymore. I stood up straight. I looked directly at Chad, the man who had called me sawdust. Frank, I said. My voice was no longer my own. It was loud. It was clear. It was the voice of the executor. Frank Peterson, I announced, and the microphone carried my voice to every corner of the room, has disinherited Jessica. A sound. It was not one sound. It was 100 sounds at once. A collective, sharp, shocked intake of air from the entire room. It was the sound of 100 people hearing a building collapse. Jessica made a small, wounded noise, a low moan. She swayed on her feet, her hand clutching at her chest. She grabbed Chad's arm, not for comfort, but for balance, to keep herself from falling. She was staring at me, her eyes hollow, uncomprehending. Disinherited. The word was an execution. I held up the legal document, the one bound in blue. I was not done. He has placed his entire estate. I continued, my voice building. The real estate company Peterson Properties, all associated properties, his liquid assets, his stocks, his entire portfolio estimated at $50 million. $50 million. The The number spoken aloud just hung there. A weight. A bomb. Into a protected trust. Ha! A laugh. A high-pitched, ugly barking sound. It was Chad. He was laughing. It was a terrible, desperate, gasping sound, the sound of a drowning man trying to convince himself he could breathe. He pushed Jessica's hand off his arm. A trust, he spat, his eyes wild. A trust. It is meaningless. It does not matter. He was performing for the room again, trying to regain control. He cannot do that. Jessica is still the beneficiary. She is his only child. The trust is for her. It does not matter. I let him finish. I let his desperate, ugly laugh echo and die in the silence. I looked at him. I gave him nothing. No anger, no triumph, just the flat, cold, final truth. No, I said. My voice was quiet, but the microphone made it a thunderclap. It cut him off. It cut him down. I looked at the document. I read the final critical line. Frank Peterson named the sole beneficiary of the trust. I paused. I let the silence stretch. I looked past the stage, past the front tables, to the one small lilac-dressed girl watching me with wide, terrified eyes. He named his granddaughter, I announced, Sophie Reed. The name just hung there. Sophie Reed. It was a name that did not belong in this room of complex deals and corporate theft. It was a name of innocence, a name of purity. And it was a blade. It slid directly into Jessica. I watched the comprehension dawn, the final, devastating understanding of what her father had truly done. He had not just disinherited her. He had bypassed her, completely erased her from the line of succession, and replaced her with my child, with the one piece of me that he could save. Jessica made a small, choking sound, a gasp that was not for air but from a fatal wound. Her eyes, which had been wide with a desperate, pleading terror, went suddenly horribly blank. Her face, already pale, lost its final trace of life. She just shut down. Her body, which she had held so rigidly, so upright in her $10,000 armor, simply gave out. She did not crumple. She did not wilt. She collapsed. A dead heavy weight, she fell straight backward. There was a soft, heavy thud as she hit the stage, a sound of profound finality. Her $10,000 dress, the symbol of her new kingdom, the prize Chad had won, crumpled beneath her like a discarded piece of paper. She was a heap of white silk and broken dreams, unconscious at her new husband's feet. Chad did not move. He did not flinch. He did not look down. He did not even blink. He did not reach for her. He did not try to catch her. His new bride, the queen, he had just toasted, the woman for whom he had orchestrated this entire victory, was gone. And he did not care. His entire world, his entire being was focused with a terrifying, singular intensity on me. His face was no longer red. The purple, sputtering rage was gone. It had been replaced by something far colder, far more lethal. It was a mask of pure, white-hot, silent rage. His eyes, the cold, flat eyes of the shark, were no longer assessing. They were murderous. He was finally seeing me, not as the pathetic carpenter, not as the ghost in the cheap suit. He was seeing the man who was holding the knife. I did not look at Jessica. I let her lie there. I looked at Chad. I let him stare. I let him see the end of his world approaching. The silence in the room was a living thing, a screaming, pressurized void. Slowly, deliberately, my hand steady, I held up the final page of the will. The blue-backed document, heavy with the weight of an empire, did not tremble. And, I said. My voice was calm. It was steady. It was not loud, but the microphone carried it, a quiet, devastating sentence. Frank Peterson, I continued, named the sole trustee of that fund. I let that word land. Trustee. The one who controls. With full... I paused, letting the words separate, each one a hammer blow, and executive control over the company, over all assets, over all $50 million. I paused again. Control until the beneficiary, my daughter, turns 25 years old. This was it. This was the moment. The entire opulent spinning room with its ice sculptures and its wall of flowers seemed to tilt on its axis. The floor dropped out from under my feet. The blinding spotlight, the sea of pale, shocked faces, the woman collapsed on the stage like a casualty of war. It all faded, narrowing into a sharp, clear, silent tunnel. At the end of that tunnel, there was only one thing. Him. I looked at Chad, the shark, the parasite, The tin-souled man, the man who had stood on this very stage bathed in this very same light and called me sawdust and empty promises. The man who had built his new life by liquidating mine. I looked him directly in his cold, dead, murderous eyes. I let him see the final line on the page. I let him read my name before I said it. And then I delivered the killing blow. Me, Benjamin Reed. The two words Benjamin Reed hung in the dead air. They were a sentence, an execution. The silence that followed was absolute, a void. Then it shattered. He's lying. The sound was not a voice. It was a raw, primal scream ripped from Chad's throat. His face, which had been white with rage, was now a deep, terrifying purple. He forged it! He shrieked, his eyes bulging. I'll kill you! He lunged, a blur of pure, murderous intent. His hands clawed, aimed at my throat. He was incredibly fast, but he did not get 2 steps. 2 large men in dark suits, men I now realized had entered and stood by the walls with Ms. Hayes moved with a professional, brutal efficiency. They intercepted him as one. Each man took an arm, twisting it, pinning him between their bodies. He was immobilized, held fast, his feet dangling just off the floor. He struggled, hissing, making animal sounds, his $5,000 suit straining at the seams. Ms. Hayes did not even flinch. She regarded the scene, her prize client now restrained like a rabid animal with a cold, flat disinterest. She smoothed the front of her navy suit jacket. "The documents are ironclad, Mr. Thorne," she said. Her voice was calm, cutting cleanly through his snarling. "And your attempts to conceal this later codicil, despite your legal obligation to report it, will be discussed at your disbarment hearing." The word disbarment was a bullet. It hit Chad harder than the 2 men. The fight, the animal rage, just evaporated. He went completely limp, a dead weight in their arms. He understood. It was over. Then from the floor came a new sound, a low, broken wailing. Jessica. I had forgotten her. She was still in a heap of white silk, her $10,000 dress ruined. She was on her hands and knees, sobbing, her makeup a black, tragic mask. She looked up at me, her eyes hollow. "Ben," she wept, her voice a pathetic, childlike plea. "Ben, please. You cannot do this. It is my money. It is my family's." I looked down at her. The woman I once loved. The woman whose laughter I once lived for. The woman who sat in a sterile office and checked her phone while our life was liquidated. I searched inside myself for any echo of that old love. I searched for pity. I searched for anger. I searched for triumph. I found nothing. Just a vast, cold, empty finality. She had made her choice. She chose the shark. "I am not doing anything, Jessica," I said. My voice was quiet, not cruel, just tired, just a fact. This is what Frank did. He was protecting his legacy. For his granddaughter. I turned away from her. I did not offer a hand. I did not offer another word. I carefully, deliberately folded Frank's handwritten letter. I folded the thick, legal, blue-backed will. The documents that represented $50 million. The documents that represented my entire future. They felt heavy, solid, and real in my hand. I slipped them into the inside breast pocket of my cheap rented tuxedo. I buttoned the jacket. I walked to the edge of the stage. I did not run. I did not hurry. I walked calmly down the 2 steps, my feet making no sound on the thick carpet. I walked past Chad. He was a broken man, a hollow shell held up by the 2 security men. His eyes were blank. He was finished. I walked past Jessica. She was still weeping on the floor, a tragic, broken queen in her ruined white dress. I did not look at her. I did not look at him. They were ghosts now. They were the past. They were irrelevant. My eyes were fixed forward. I walked through the silent, parted sea of stunned guests. 100 pairs of eyes followed me, but they did not matter. I walked directly to the main table, the royal table where my daughter sat all alone, watching everything. Her eyes were as big as saucers. I saw fear in them, but I also saw a dawning, wondrous understanding. I knelt down in front of her. I ignored the gasps of the guests. I ignored the entire ruined, chaotic, $1 million wedding. In that moment, there were only 2 people in the entire world, me and her. "Hey, pumpkin," I whispered. My voice was gentle again. It was my own. "That was a lot." She did not speak. She just stared at me. "How about we get out of here?" I asked. "You want to go get some ice cream?" A tiny, scared, brilliant smile touched her lips. She nodded. Just once. It was all I needed. I stood up. I took her small hand in mine. Then in a single fluid motion I reached down and picked her up, settling her on my hip. Her small 7-year-old arms wrapped around my neck and she squeezed, hard. She buried her face in my shoulder. I held her tight. I turned my back on the stage. I turned my back on my former life. I turned my back on the woman who had betrayed me and the man who had tried to destroy me. And without a single backward glance I walked straight out of that ballroom. I walked past the melting ice swans. I walked past the towering fragrant wall of dead flowers. I walked through the grand lobby, past the staring hotel staff. The heavy glass automatic doors slid open, a silent, respectful gesture. The cool, clean night air hit my face. It was a shocking, beautiful, glorious cold. The mothball suit still stank. It still felt cheap and confining. But as I held my daughter in my arms and took my first deep, shuddering breath of free air for the first time in so many, many years, I could finally breathe. The game was over, and the man they all thought was a pawn, the man they had dismissed as sawdust, was now in charge of the entire board. True strength isn't measured by what you own, but by what you can endure. It's being trusted with a legacy, not because you are powerful, but because your character was proven when you were powerless. Honesty is the only foundation that will never collapse.